Okay, is this gone? Do 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 do. Connecting. Alright, so I got a notification that I am now live. I am holding off for a few seconds just to let everything catch up, okay? And hopefully this will be fine. So, this morning I am trying out some new software that actually runs Facebook Live through, which is looking pretty cool so far. And I am just going to wait a few seconds to make sure that everything is all hunky-dory. And this is early in the morning, 7:40 a.m. That's not really early, but it's early to some people. I think everyone's day should get started around 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. unless you are a new parent, like me and my wife are new parents. Our day gets started whenever it gets started. But anyways, so guys, this is going to be a fun little talk that we're going through today, which is discussing this really, really crappy piece of research and opinionated associated article with it, discussing how eggs increase risk of diabetes. So we're just going to kind of jump straight into this, and this is going to be really fun. When we look at nutritional research, I think pretty much everyone is quite aware of the fact that you see headlines, and it's largely just headlines that people discuss, that are just all over the place. You can find nutritional research that confirms any bias anybody has. So if people are like pro-vegan, you can find research that confirms a vegan diet is better for you. If people are pro-eating meat, same thing. If people are pro, there should be a balance and you should eat a little bit from every single food group. You can find quote-unquote research that confirms that. However, what people rarely do is actually look at the research itself. So when we look at this little post, this has been making the rounds on Instagram quite a bit in the last week, even though the research itself is from 2012, but that's not really important. When we look at this, so it's just this is kind of for an article written about it or an Instagram post, basically the same thing. So this is an author's opinion based off of research. This is not the research itself. But if we read through it, even just a single egg a week may, in parentheses, or may not, that's how that word works, increase the risk, meaning the cause of diabetes. So when we use the term risk, this is actually extremely inappropriate because risk means causation. Risk is, it refers to cause and effect. If there's a risk of something happening, that means that this is going to cause that to happen under whatever circumstances. So this is in effect, because it's not saying anything to the contrary, it's saying that consumption of eggs at least once a week will cause diabetes. That's what this is implying. This was also posted by Dr. Michael Greger, who runs the Nutrition Facts Instagram page and website, and I'm sure they're on other social media as well, not so important. He is a vegan medical doctor from Linda Loma in California, which is a vegan medical establishment. They preach veganism. They have an agenda to push. They are owned and governed by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so they have a religious agenda to push for vegetarianism or veganism. Actually, I don't even think they push vegetarianism anymore. That's what they started out with. But now it's a case of, like, all meat, all animal products are, horrible for you. You cannot consume anything. It leads to sexual desire. It leads to basically horniness, and so it's evil. That's why you cannot consume animal products. And that the world basically needs to go vegan for the second coming of Christ to happen. I am not making that up. And if anyone's thinking, it's just a simple religious establishment, that's not really a big deal. Well, they own the Kellogg's company. They're actually extremely powerful economically. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is actually conveniently the 7th richest religious establishment, according to Wikipedia at least, or whatever Google search that was, in the world. Financially, they're extremely powerful, and they do push an agenda for pushing plant-based food. which is not what human beings are biologically built for, but more on that later or in a different video. So what we're going to do here, actually look at the research that this article is based off of. So even just a single egg a week may increase the risk of diabetes. Does it? Let's actually look at what this is based on. Alrighty. So from PubMed, egg consumption and the risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus, a case control study. Interesting saying a case control study. Oops. Because there's practically no control in this. Made by Lena Radzivzini, no idea how to say that, et al. From 2012. So something funny is that some people will say, oh, this is from 2012, it's outdated research. And this is something that people will say when... So when I was in uni, we were very much encouraged that whenever we were to examine research and meta-analyses and stuff to provide like some sort of case study on or research paper on, it was supposed to be done within the last 20 years. That's what our recommendation was. However, in properly controlled research experiments, one of the key factors of having good, solid research is reproducibility, meaning that a different group of scientists do the same research, the same experiment, and they should come out with the same results. That's important. However, with a lot of studies like these, the results from this can quite literally be all over the place. So there's an issue there, and that's because there's no controls properly. Research, we can get research all the way back from, the 1960s, 1940s, 1920s, 1800s, as long as it was properly conducted, following the actual rules and guidelines of the scientific method and methodology, we can reproduce it time and time again. Doesn't matter who does it, doesn't matter when it's done. It's the same research. Science doesn't really change like that. The perspective can change, and that's an important distinction. Alright, so let's actually look at this itself. Abstract. And my hope here is that this is going to shine a light on why so much nutritional research is absolute bullshit. And that the people who conduct research like this, they're often pushing an agenda. They're not actually trying to be truthful. Their objective here is not to help enhance human health and performance. That's not the point. Their point is to push their ideology. And that's always something to try and look out for when people are giving things like this. So there's going to be a few common mistakes that's presented through this that are just really basic ideas that anybody can look out for. So basically, if you see these words, this means that the research, it doesn't matter if it's peer-reviewed, it doesn't matter if it's published, it doesn't matter if it's a meta-analysis. Hell, there are some companies where you can basically just pay the journaling company to publish your research, and that's it. Doesn't matter what you're writing about. Doesn't matter what the quality of the research was. If you pay for it, you can have it published. It's total garbage. And so people read headlines from it, or journalists will make articles related to that, and it's just their own opinion piece, and it just pushes an emotional reaction from people, and just makes people, it's just trying to guide people to feeling a certain way about a certain topic. So again, just going through my notes, making sure I didn't miss anything through that intro. Alright, so going through the objective here. Type 2 diabetes mellitus appears, and it may appear to, it may not appear to, involve an interaction between susceptible genetic backgrounds and environmental factors, including highly calorific diet. So we're saying that type 2 diabetes is susceptible to genetics. Yes, in a way, there are some genetically driven metabolic processes, which, if abused, do lead to type 2 diabetes. So something that I would want to do here is something that's very important in research is making sure that people are on the same page about definitions. Definitions are important. I would definitely have a definition for what type 2 diabetes actually is to make sure that everything in the research is falling in line with that definition. So when we talk about there being a genetic history and an environmental factor, it's more environmental. Can there be some genetic components to it? Sure, but it's not a case of like you're just genetically driven to have type 2 diabetes and it doesn't really matter too much what you eat or anything. you're going to develop it. And that's a perspective that a lot of people have, and it's not valid. Type 2 diabetes is a metabolic condition. It is a metabolic problem. It is a condition where when you consume both carbohydrates and fats, you activate the fatty acid glucose cycle, otherwise known as the Randle cycle, which is a condition where when your body is consuming fats, the cells that are absorbing those fats, they basically lock out the input of sugar. Those cells can now no longer absorb sugar. And so the sugar will build up in your bloodstream. That is toxic. That's kind of akin to type 1 diabetes. So the sugar has to get stored. So historically, this will be what happens in the winter. Some fruit comes out, and we can now eat some fruit along with the meat and the fat, and that helps us to store more body fat. So that glucose will actually get stored in that condition, and it can also happen in the other way, which is that if you consume lots and lots of sugar, your cells basically get filled up with sugar, and now they lock out the fats from getting in because they're just too full. And your body pretty much always prioritizes glucose absorption into the cells because glucose, beyond what your body naturally makes through gluconeogenesis, is toxic. Ingesting carbohydrates, ingesting sugar, it is not healthy. So if we look at type 1 diabetics before the synthesis of insulin, they would have an issue of producing enough insulin to regulate their blood sugar effectively. And they would typically die by about the age of 12 to 15 or so. So get to the early to mid-teenage years before they die from basically glycation of their tissues, which is the effect that excessive amounts of sugar in your blood has on your tissues, the damage, the inflammation that it creates. So they have that systemic inflammation going on. And that's why you can do like blood works, like people consume sugar and you can see their triglycerides going up in their blood. It's like, yes, that's the Randle cycle in action. And also vice versa, depending on kind of what the bias in the food is, as far as I understand it. If there's a few tiny details that are wrong in the Randle cycle, it is a little bit, there's lots of details in it. But moving on from that, so we want to understand that type 2 diabetes is a metabolic disorder. The Randle cycle is being habitually, it's being chronically activated. Your cells are locking out, well, they're absolutely chock-a-block with glucose, and they're locking out glucose and fat from being further absorbed. People will refer to this as insulin resistance. That's not listed here, that's not important for this conversation, but that's a kind of a misnomer. Your body's not resistant to the insulin. It's just that the insulin can't do its job anymore. Or maybe it can do its job, it's just not, there's nothing that can be done. Insulin is to help your body, your cells to absorb glucose. It opens up the receptors for it. If your cells are already full of glucose, they can't take in anymore. So we'll see a case of there's insulin being released, but the blood sugar isn't changing. Well, it's because your cells are already so full of sugar and they need to get rid of it, and it's destroying your cells. So, getting back onto the objective here, as it is important to identify modifiable risk factors, so factors that cause changes, that may help reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus, so reducing risk factors, reducing causal factors, so established mechanistic factors that actually cause type 2 diabetes, which is not what we're actually looking at. The aim of the present study was to determine the association, okay, that's a different word, association and risk. Typically, you can't really use these two words together. Association means these two factors, whatever's being looked at, or multiple factors, are in some way related to each other in some imaginative way. It doesn't really matter like how far-fetched it is out there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that specifically at the end, but something that's really important that people seem to forget about is that association never means causation. Just because two things are associated with each other does not mean those two things cause each other. And that's a really big thing. That's normally something that people learn very early on, like in university. So if you're doing any kind of like sciencey study, like I studied physiology, something you learn very early on is that association does not infer causation. So you cannot say that there's an association between egg consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes. Those are two separate things. Risk is saying cause and effect. So you really shouldn't be using association and risk in the same sentence. And that's done multiple times there. Okay, so they're trying to say that genetic and environmental factors in a high calorific diet. Define a high calorific diet. How much is like too much? Where's the line that if you cross that threshold for calories, it's too much? But also, this is one of the very first things to look for in nutritional research, that if it's making any sort of point about using calories as a baseline for establishing any kind of nutritional effect, it's largely just something to be disregarded. Calories are not a valid way of measuring nutrition. Calories are not a measurement of nutrition. They're a measurement of change in heat by definition. Calorie comes from the Latin word calor, meaning heat. It is defined explicitly as the amount of energy needed to change 1 cubic centimeter of water by 1 degree Celsius. What in the world does altering, temperature have to do with any of this? Not too much. So like if you sit in a hot tub and that increases the temperature of your skin, you can measure that change of temperature in calories. That's what that unit is used for. It is not actually relevant for nutrition in any way, shape, or form. More on that in a different video coming up. Okay, so looking at the design. Oh boy, this is the next part. A specifically designed questionnaire. A questionnaire is not research. A questionnaire is not any sort of scientific experiment. What this is saying right off the bat is that these guys did not do any kind of controlled research experimental study at all in any way, shape, or form. What they did was that they sent out to people, and we'll get to that later, a survey to self-report on. Alright, so big problem with this. Guys, think about what you had for lunch back in the middle of April 2022. Think about what you had for lunch just last year on the second Wednesday of the month. That's kind of things that they are often looking for in these questionnaires, and there are other things that they're looking for. We'll get to that when we get to the results down there. You can kind of see it there at the bottom. But the point is that when people self-report on what they eat, it's like people don't remember what they eat. And people lie on these things, and not even maliciously. It's like, you don't remember what you eat at any point. Trying to ask people a survey about what they were eating over whatever length of time, it's absolutely ridiculous, and that's not proper scientific study. There's no control to it whatsoever, and it's typically they're asking such detailed questions that they're missing a bigger picture. So for example, and I'll repeat this again in a bit, if they're asking people, did you consume eggs? Well, are they asking if they consume anything else at all? Is there any sort of analysis of what they ate in totality? Little hint of that. No, there's absolutely none of that whatsoever. So it says that it was a specifically designed questionnaire. Okay, sure. That makes it a field called epidemiology. Epidemiology, literally meaning around a population, is where people will look for associative data. So they're looking for associations. Is this effect in some way associated with that effect? Does it have anything to do with it whatsoever? So for example, really common example used here is that if we examine on hot summer days, there's an increase in ice cream sales on the beach. There's an association between the day on the beach being hotter and there being an increase in ice cream sales. That's a very real thing. So what people can look at, if you really wanted to really stretch your imagination, you could say there is a association, there's a correlation between ice cream sales and getting sunburned. Those two do not cause each other. they have no cause and effect whatsoever. There is no risk to either one of those via the other, but there is an association. So that's where the issue of association and causation comes in. It's like you cannot say anything about causation just because you analyze that there is in fact an increase in ice cream sales along with people getting increased rates of reported sunburns. Well, what does cause sunburns? Being out in the sun, diet can play an impact on that, not having sunscreen if your diet is one that makes you susceptible to that, and a whole bunch of other factors as well. Ice cream does not cause sunburn, but you can take that analysis, take that association, and try to stretch a research article on that. I actually want to try to find if someone has done that because they probably have. Not so important here though. Okay, moving on. A specifically designed questionnaire was used to collect information, yada yada yada. The odds ratio, basically a measure of association between exposure and an outcome. So basically saying, what are the odds that this association is accurate? This is still epidemiology. This is still just looking at associative data. And these are things that will cause a lot of people to, even if they try to read the research, unless you take a statistics course, you're not really going to understand a lot of the words used here. So odds ratios, confidence intervals, conditional logistic regression, that will make people's eyes just glaze over. And it makes it very difficult to read the rest of the stuff because you don't understand what's going on. You don't have to understand this. All you have to understand is that this was done via a questionnaire. That is not valid research. It does not matter that this is published. It does not matter if it was peer-reviewed. It should never have been peer-reviewed. This is not peer-review worthy. This is worthy of epidemiology, which means, okay, we can see that there may be an association between egg consumption and type 2 diabetes. Doesn't mean that one causes the other in any way, shape, or form. So what this is meant for, really, in reality, is that this can be sent off to real scientists who do real experimental studies and say, hey, there's a possible association here. Could you now go to this population and do an actual experiment to see if there is a risk between egg consumption and type 2 diabetes? To which they would very clearly find no, unless the people were eating massive amounts of carbs with the fatty eggs. That could lead to an issue because of the aforementioned Randall cycle. So setting a case control study in a Lithuanian outpatient clinic was performed in 2001. Cool. Subjects, a total of 234 cases with newly confirmed diagnoses of type 2 diabetes mellitus and 468 controls free of the disease. So it's 700. So N equals 702 total people. And who were these people? Do we know anything about them outside of the fact that, those 234, they were recently confirmed with type 2 diabetes? How recently? That would be important to know. How long they had it? What sort of diet did they have leading up to that? What kind of diet have they had, most recently? The 468 controls free of the disease. Is that really a control? What were they eating? What is the control for this? Are they kept in a laboratory, under control, under lock and key, with a given diet, with a given exercise, with given social interactions? Are those actually being controlled for? Those would be considered confounding variables, confounding factors that basically there'd be so much that can impact this, it's meaningless. There's no way that we can infer any kind of risk from such limited data, but we're going to get on that a little bit more in a bit. Alright, so results. Variables such as BMI, body mass index, which is the most worthless associative idea of health in the world. BMI, people like to use BMI as a measure of health. It does not measure health. So it's a ratio of your height to weight. People can have the same BMI and one person can be overweight, the other person can be very muscular. And they will have the same BMI. One person is healthier than the other. 5 guesses as to which one. Family history of diabetes. Diabetes is not really a genetic factor. There might be genetic things that might make it easier. In fact, I wouldn't be able to prove this in any sort of way, but it does make sense, and I'll talk about it when specifically talking about type 2 diabetes in another video, which is that some people, some populations, some ethnicities most assuredly are much more susceptible to developing type 2 diabetes. They put on body fat way easier. So family history can play a role, but when you're looking at a very specific population, and like it's the same ethnicity, the genetic factor basically goes out the window. Cigarette smoking, so looking at like chronic inflammation from that, education, morning exercise, do you exercise or not, plasma tag, which I believe is plasma triglyceride level, so measuring triacylglycerol levels in your blood, and that could be something to do with, you consume a lot of sugar and you see that your fat levels go up in your blood, so they assume without any sort of actual mechanism that that is bad, but don't actually know what they were doing with those plasma tag levels. We'll see. They were retained in multivariate logistic regression models as confounders because these things can have a big impact, because their inclusion changed the value of the odds ratio by more than 10% in any exposure categories. Yet all of those factors, depending on what side of the spectrum these people are on, it's going to make a big difference in whether or not they develop type 2 diabetes. Next part is another very important thing to actually look at after adjustment for possible confounders. Always watch out for the word adjustment. This means that they adjust the data set. And let's see. So if we scroll down a little bit to this little bit, control variable validity and differential treatment effectiveness. That's not important. The use of control variables for statistical adjustment. This is just kind of to define this a little bit and provide a little bit of context for you guys. Is motivated primarily by a desire to increase the internal validity of the study. So basically they adjust the data set to fit their views. They have altered the data. It is no longer objective. It has now lost all merit. Actually, it lost all merit earlier when it was using association and risk in the same sentence. So that's something to look out for. It lost all merit when it said it was done by a questionnaire. That is not valid. That is not real science. So that alone makes it get thrown out. Putting all of these things together makes it just all the more worthless. This whole research has a value of 0. Doesn't matter how many people share it on social media. You can multiply 0 by 1,000,000. The worth is still 0. So we've seen that they've adjusted the data, so it's worthless. After adjustment for possible confounders, more than 2-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes. So after making adjustments to, the confounders, removing ones that don't suit our agenda, people had a increased risk, so an increased cause. What was the causal factor there, though? So you can't use that word. Was determined for individuals consuming 3 to 4.9 eggs per week, and 3-fold increase of the disease was determined for individuals consuming greater than 5 eggs a week. So 3 times the risk of diabetes if you were consuming more than 5 eggs a week. Oh boy. Compared to those eating less than 1 egg a week. So they're trying to show, without showing any other sort of data, that if an individual consumes more than 1 egg a week, basically you're doubling to tripling your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. There is no risk established there. There is no mechanism established there. We cannot say that eating an egg causes type 2 diabetes. They're not providing any sort of mechanism for how that would happen. They're basically just saying, if an egg exists in your body, it causes type 2 diabetes. That's not the way it works at all. As well, what we would actually need to know here is, what else were they eating? Were they literally only eating these eggs, and that was it in the week? Some people were eating 5 eggs a week. Some people were eating 3 eggs a week. Some people were eating just half an egg every week. There's no other data that's actually supplied here, so we can't use this. I mean, already this has completely reduced its value, reduced its merit to absolute 0 just in the first few sentences. Actually, just in the title alone. So we can't use this in any way, shape, or form. These data points, it doesn't matter how many data points they would actually get off of this, it's worthless. There's no merit to this at all. Conclusions, our data support a possible relationship and also a possible non-existent relationship. That's how that works of egg consumption and increased risk of type 2 diabetes mellitus, yada yada. Here's a couple of things to look out for, guys. Actually, I'm just going to go back because I missed something in my notes here. So just going back on with the adjustment thing, this means that the data is being manipulated. Seeing that things are adjusted automatically makes things lose all credibility. It's no longer objective. Really, this means to the scientists who are actually doing this, stop fucking about with the data. Just simply report back on what is observed. There can't be any bias in this. We can't have an agenda. We have to actually just report on what's being told, or what the research is actually telling us, what the study, what the experiment is telling us. And we have so many records now. I'm going to compile a list of things where research data was hidden away, it was suppressed for many decades before it was found because it wasn't destroyed. Jolly good on that. Confirming things like so a lot of it showing about how sugar is really healthy for you and it's perfectly fine to consume sugar as long as it's done in moderation. And research showing that that's not the case at all. That research does not get published, it gets hidden away, then it's found later on, and then the scientists are asked about it and they report back like, hey, why did you not publish this research? This does not confirm what we're finding now is like this stuff is absolutely toxic for us. And they didn't publish it because they did not like the results of it. It confirmed that their hypothesis was absolutely wrong, and that's corruption. That's them following an agenda, and that's them lying about it. Okay, moving on. So trying to suggest all this stuff is just absolute bollocks. And this is further garbage because like something else we would need to know is like how would the eggs have to be prepared? Can they be raw and still have an effect? What about eggs used in things like baking? Does that count in any way, shape, or form? There's a lot of other questions we can ask for this. Here's a little list of things to look out for in general when it comes to nutritional research. And basically, if there's any one of these, it completely ruins the research in every single way possible. And it just means throw it out, don't listen to it. It's not valid. Associative studies. Always look for the word association. Association is meaningless. Can get on that more in just a little bit. Survey or questionnaire. Meaningless. People self-reporting on what they've eaten. That's not science. That is not research. That is not an experiment because there is no control. Something else to look for. Any mechanisms being described. Okay, so you're saying that eggs cause type 2 diabetes. How? What is the biochemical, metabolical cause of that? What is the mechanism that establishes that change in your metabolism that creates type 2 diabetes? Explain that in some way. No experimental controls, which means that there's not an actual experiment. You cannot have an experiment without controls. So what we would need to do for so like Bart K talks about this all the time, like this is how actual nutritional research would have to be conducted, and this is why there is practically no real nutritional research, because it can't be done. The way proper nutritional research would be done is that you take multiple sets of genetically identical twins, ideally thousands of pairs of them, have as much population as possible. They are separated at birth. Every single one is kept under lock and key in a laboratory. They are observed constantly throughout their entire life. They are interacted with in the exact same way, spoken to in the exact same way, emotionally interacted with in the exact same way. They are fed the exact same every single day of their life, except for changing this one variable that you're wanting to test for in one of the pairs with consistency. So everything is kept as controlled as possible, except for that one variable, and that variable is what you're testing for. So you would actually have to be feeding them eggs or not feeding them eggs, and then introduce eggs, and then see over their lifetime, was there actually an increased rate of diabetes in the ones who consumed eggs. That's how this would be performed. That will never happen, ever. No ethics committee would ever sign off on that. There's not going to be thousands and thousands of parents, or really any parents, who will give up their twins to be subjected to that. And I'm sure there are some very few scientists in the world who would be happy to conduct such an experiment, but widely, I highly doubt that. And also the funding for that would be absolutely obscene. And you would have to track these people basically for their entire life. It's not going to happen. There is no proper nutritional research because that is how you have controls in a scientific research. Think about if you have a physics experiment. You have to control all the variables as much as possible. Anything you can't control or is not controlled for is a confounding variable, and those confounding variables can change the meat here so much that, if there's no control, it's not valid at all. That's the point there. So always look out for, is there actually any real control being observed? If not, it's not a real research experiment. It is meaningless. The use of the term, this is basically the same thing, but the use of the term risk when there's no causation supplied. There is no causation or risk of eggs with type 2 diabetes. None whatsoever. And also lack of definitions. I'm really big on supplying definitions and making sure that everyone is on the same page about what we're talking about. We cannot have assumptions. We cannot have people assuming that type 2 diabetes is defined as one thing and then another group is defining it some other way. It doesn't work like that. And here's just a fun little thing. I will zoom in here. This is a association of the age of Miss America from 1999 through 2009, really through about 2008 there, and murders. I'm going to guess this is in America. Murders by steam or hot vapors or hot objects. There is a trend of the amount of murders by those causations and the age of Miss America who won in that year. This is an association. They very much correlate with each other. They do not cause each other. Anyone will look at this and be like, well, that's just silly. That's crazy. But it is an association. There is an association there for a fact. Doesn't mean that they actually have anything to do with each other, that one causes the other in any sort of way, but this is what people look for with a lot of nutrition or epidemiological research. The point of epidemiology is to find things like this, to find associations. So now we would actually send in scientists, not that this specific example would be worth it, to do an actual experiment, however they would do it for this, to find, is there an actual cause? Is there an actual causal mechanism here supplied? If not, it's just a coincidence. And that's all this is showing. Okay, so in the research done here, there was a coincidence of some population of people who consume more eggs, and we have no idea what else they were eating, confounding variables. It's not worth looking at. So rest assured, guys, eggs are absolutely healthy for you. They are nature's multivitamin. You can eat as many as you want. Don't consume them with sugar, or try to minimize the amount of carbs as much as possible. Eggs have a lot of fat. The fat will lock out the sugar. Sugar's toxic for you anyways. Try to minimize as much as you can, especially if you're trying to be, an athlete, if you're trying to be strong, if you're trying to live a pain-free body, because it does cause inflammation. That's why type 1 diabetes, and therefore having uncontrolled or minimally controlled blood sugar levels, is deadly. Okay, that's it for me, guys. If you have any questions at all, I'm just checking. I need to check back and forth between the comments a lot more. If anyone has any questions, you can always feel free to ask. I'm going to hold off for just a little minute before canceling out of this, and to see if anyone has anything to say. This went on about twice as long as I thought it was going to. I will ramble like crazy, won't I? But yeah, I hope this helps. If you can actually, see these 5 or 6 things when looking at nutritional research, it makes it extremely apparent that the vast majority of nutrition research is just absolute bollocks. Like, it's absolute crap. It's just driving an agenda for people who hate people, basically. They don't care about your health and your performance, and you can see that with a lot of certain people who push for ideologies like what this research is trying to show. They are frail, they're sickly. They're not people that you want to get health advice from at all. So yeah, just things to look out for. Really hope that's helpful and useful to you guys. And I will See y'all whenever this is going to get published up on YouTube. So yeah, love you guys. Hope you all enjoyed, and hope you have a great rest of your day. We are hitting the -Celsius temperature here today. It is getting chilly. I should have been wearing a jacket today. I am cold. Alright, you are welcome, Debbie, and yeah, that is it for today. See you guys later.